Hello, welcome back to the Bio 122 video lectures about Chapter 34 on Animal Nutrition Digestive System. This is video 14, talking specifically about the vertebrate digestive system. So several variations exist even amongst vertebrates. Now, of course, they all have a complete digestive system, so a complete alimentary canal, so it's very efficient. But there's also variations that depend on the lifestyle of the animal, the vertebrate, that have evolved over time. And so one of the ones we're going to start off with is the bird digestive system. Shares many similarities with the human digestive system, but it has some specializations. First of all, if we look at the esophagus, that serves the same function as what we're going to see in a human, where it's simply transferring food from the mouth. Well, in the human, it would transfer it to the stomach, but the stomach in birds have some different specialization. So the first three terms over here we're going to talk about are specializations called the crop, the proventriculus, and the gizzard. That separate some of the functions that we have in our single stomach. So the crop is the first organ that comes at the bottom of the esophagus and before the proventriculus. And a crop does only one thing. It just stores food so that it allows the bird to consume a fairly large quantity of food at once, which is beneficial to it because it is vulnerable when it's feeding, and then can store the food until it can be processed at a later date or a later time within a few hours. This is different from a human stomach because a true stomach not only stores food, but it also possesses enzymes so it carries out digestion. A crop does not do any form of digestion. So it's only for storage. So that's why we don't call it a stomach. Instead, the next section leaving the crop is called the proventriculus. This is the first time enzymatic breakdown of foods begin in the digestive tract of birds. This is where the chemical digestion. In a human, the crop and the proventriculus would be combined. So this is one difference in a bird. But then the third component is a gizzard, which does what we call mechanical digestion. And it does so by generating calcium stones internally, or birds will also physically eat pebbles for the sole purpose of putting them into the gizzard. And then the gizzard is a very muscular organ that then churns it around like a washing machine. If we look at a human stomach, it's surrounded by muscle that does a similar churning type action, but the real breaking apart and the grinding that a human does is with our teeth. Birds don't have teeth. So you're going to see a gizzard in animals that don't have teeth. In animals that have teeth, the teeth essentially serve the function of the gizzard. So beyond that point, the digestive tracts of birds and humans are extremely similar for a long segment, because then leaving the gizzard, you get inputs from the liver that contains bile that emulsifies fats. And we also have enzymes coming from the pancreas, which is where the majority of enzymes. This is identical to how this works in a human. Then we have the small intestine, which is the primary location for final digestion and the absorption of nutrients. And again, that's identical to how a human works. And then the large intestine down here in the bird, we're going to be reabsorbing a lot of the water that was used in the digestive process and then absorbing a few of the vitamins. Not much nutrition is absorbed. Most of that is done in the small intestine. Then we start getting differences between the bird and the human because we have two small ceca that come out that we talked about in the previous section are particularly useful for organisms, animals that are digesting a lot of cellulose fibers. So the ceca are filled with symbiotic bacteria to help in the digestion of very difficult to digest cellulose. But these are fairly small compared to what you see in the pig or what you see in other pure herbivores, because birds are generally omnivorous. So this is kind of similar to the appendix in humans in the fact that they have diminished function. And then the final difference is that instead of having a rectum, birds combine the opening for feces and the opening for urine, and also the reproductive tract, the laying of eggs. So there's only one exit out of the body for both undigested food in the form of feces, but also metabolic waste in the form of urine, and for the laying of eggs or the reproductive functions. In humans, this would be three completely separate orifices: the anus, the urethra, and the vagina for delivery of the fetus. So the reason is birds need to be streamlined and need to have the smallest possible head and tail in order to be the physics of flight to be efficient and have low friction. So these are evolutionary adaptations that work well for the bird. So let's look at another example. Again, we're going to see a trend here where some of the most complex digestive systems belong to the herbivores, because plant-based material is the most difficult to digest. Animal flesh is relatively easy to digest. And so another solution, we saw in the previous video a cecotrope, like a rabbit, that have a large cecum, but then they excrete the small, soft fecal pellets, and then they reconsume them to break apart the fibers with the help of the bacteria that have broken things down in the cecum. Ruminants like goats, cows, actually don't have an extensive cecum, so they have a different strategy to this. Instead, they have 4 different stomachs, and instead of reconsuming soft feces, they actually regurgitate the food from the stomach in the form of a cud, and this actually serves a similar purpose. So if we look at the 4 different stomachs and this figure from your textbook, first of all, let's pay attention to the red line, because that is the first ingestion of the food. And the food will initially pass into the largest of the stomachs, called the rumen. And that part of the stomach contains prokaryotes, bacteria, and protists. So this is really the same function that the cecum has in some other herbivorous animals. And these bacteria produce the enzymes that are able to break down cellulose fibers and also start fermenting it. And so this is the first chemical digestion of these cellulose fibers. As it gets broken down, it gets moved into the reticulum, which is the second stomach, has very similar properties. It also contains bacteria. But what separates this from the rumen is that, well, it's the most anterior portion and is directly underneath the esophagus. So the reticulum is also surrounded by muscle that allows it to constrict and then push the food backwards up the esophagus so that we can regurgitate the cud and now start applying mechanical digestion. So remember we saw in the bird, the gizzard will do mechanical digestion after enzyme digestion began in the proventriculum. Here, we're doing enzymes, but from bacteria, and then we regurgitate and then start chewing again so that the bacteria can get into all the nooks and crannies of that cellulose, and it also starts tearing it up. Also, remember, they have a lot of very flat molars that allows them to grind the cud and helps with that mechanical digestion. Then the cud, now much smaller particle size than the original food was, travels back down the esophagus, and because it's smaller, it's able to fall through the roof of the third stomach, the omocoeum. The omocoeum receives the newly fine particles of the cud, and the omocoeum starts removing the water that was used for all this processing, and also helps absorb some of the minerals. But then, having said that, we really don't have probably a perfect understanding of all the things happening in the omocoeum, other than just the fact that we know that it reabsorbs quite a bit of water, and then the food particles will travel to the abomacium, which is the fourth stomach, which is basically performing the same functions as a non-ruminant or like a human stomach. So we do have some very specific enzymes to digest proteins. And that's the same thing as what's going to happen in the human stomach. And we add hydrochloric acid, and this actually starts destroying some of the bacteria that may have traveled in from the rumen. And now we basically enter the small intestine, and this is going to be very similar to the human digestive tract from that point forward. Most digestion and absorption is going to occur in the small intestine. The large intestine is going to extract the remaining water and also extract a few of the vitamins. And then the rectum and the anus, the feces will be removed. Unlike a cecum, they won't reconsume the feces because they've already extracted everything possible. Okay, and there's also liver and pancreas. It's not shown here for so that you can see the other things, but the liver and pancreas are also going to be performing really the same functions that we're going to see in the human digestive system. So let's get to the human digestive tract. So a quick summary, we're going to be exploring this in the lab too. And so this figure kind of summarizes everything. Let's start on the right side because this is the information you need to know about different steps along the way as we are doing a very efficient compartmentalized digestion of foods that have been ingested. And the point of ingestion, or where it occurs, is going to be in the mouth. And from that point, we actually begin some of the first stages of digestion and the fact that we start chewing things. So that's mechanical digestion. Then we are going to form the food into what we call a bolus and then move it down the pharynx, where we have muscles, involuntary muscles, that's going to trigger swallowing. The pharynx is actually shared with the respiratory tract. So we're going to talk about the pharynx again in the next chapter we cover. From the pharynx, it's going to move into the esophagus, where it's covered by smooth muscle, the type of muscle that surrounds the internal organs, and it's going to generate what we call peristalsis to push food down to the stomach. And once we get to the stomach, well, this is what we call a complete stomach, unlike what's seen in the bird, where it goes into a crop. But remember, a crop does not actually do any steps of digestion. It's only storing. A stomach will store food, but it will also begin the digestion of it. Very specifically, we're digesting proteins. It's the first time we start digesting proteins, but we're also going to do mechanical digestion because we're going to churn the food like in a washing machine. So it kind of serves the purpose of a crop in a bird, plus the proventriculus and the gizzard, because it's doing chemical, mechanical digestion together with storage of the food. From the stomach, we're going to move food to the small intestine, which is where the final digestion, the final breakdown into the smallest molecules occurs, and that's where we're going to absorb the vast majority of nutrients. Practically nothing useful is absorbed in the stomach, nor only a few things are absorbed in the large intestine. Mostly the large intestine is for reabsorption of water, and just a few of the salt minerals, sodium and potassium and things like that. And then the rectum is going to store waste material and then allow us to eliminate at certain times. And the anus is, of course, the exit from the body. But we also have several accessory organs. So in the mouth, we have saliva glands, so that in addition to mechanical digestion of chewing and eating, we also begin chemical digestion specifically of starches, a type of carbohydrate, because the saliva contains an enzyme that starts breaking down carbohydrates. So we saw in herbivores that are primarily eating plants with large numbers of carbohydrates, that carbohydrates are very difficult to digest. And that's also true in the human digestive tract, because actually we start chemical digestion of carbohydrates before we start it with protein, because carbohydrate digestion begins in the mouth, protein digestion begins in the stomach. We also have, as the food is leaving the stomach, the liver is producing a molecule called bile, which is like a detergent. It will allow the fat to dissolve into the water. It's not an enzyme, so it doesn't do any digestion on its own, but it allows enzymes to gain access to the fats. It's like a detergent. The gallbladder sits just underneath the liver, and the only thing the gallbladder does is actually store the bile in between meals. It doesn't actually produce the bile. The only place the bile is produced is the liver. So these two things go together, and they will add the bile right where the stomach enters the small intestine. On the other side of that small intestine, in the exact same location, is where the pancreas lies. And the pancreas actually produces the vast majority of enzymes for digestion. We only have a couple of enzymes have been added so far, the ones in the saliva, the ones in the stomach, but the pancreas produces several dozen enzymes to break down the final products. So all of this is added just as it enters the small intestine. So pancreas, gallbladder, liver, and saliva glands are what we call accessory organs. Okay, so that's the end of this kind of short summary of just the overall digestive process. In the next video, we'll talk much more about the specific details of the human digestive tract. Good day.